Okay, we come now to Plotinus, and you may wonder, why is Plotinus significant? Why did I have to read a chapter on Plotinus? And Nash is correct. He is the third great philosopher from the ancient world. He's quite a while after Aristotle. Aristotle is in the 300s BC. This is the 200s AD. So it's after the time of Christ. And let's just get into the specifics about him. But the reason why this matters is because Aristotle, or excuse me, rather Augustine, who is the next philosopher we'll deal with, and who's a Christian philosopher, is a Platonist. But he's reading Plato through the filter of Plotinus. So what he's getting in his sources for information were not as secure in the ancient world as they are for us now. Libraries and referencing and indexing and all these things were not quite the same. Aristotle, for instance, goes out of anybody's awareness, and Aristotelian writings are lost in the West, and they're restored to the West through Muslim philosophers who had them translated into Latin so that they would be able to have access to them. And it's via the Muslim translations that we have Aquinas in the 13th century being able to interact with the writings of Aristotle. And so also with Plato, people weren't aware of what was Plato and what was Plato's commentators, or if they were, sometimes all they had available to them were commentators on Plato. And so when we deal with Augustine, the next chapter in the book, you're going to see a lot of similarities to Augustine and Plotinus. And that's why we're dealing with Plotinus. But he's an interesting philosopher in his own right. Okay, let's just dive in. So he's the third most important philosopher of the ancient world. His time frame is the early 3rd century, the 200s AD. He's the bridge between Hellenic philosophy and Christianity slash the Hellenistic world. So he's a bridge between the Greek, or the Mycenaeans, and who became the Greeks, their world, which is the world of Aristotle and Plato, and then that world, which is the Hellenistic world, where you have the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is interesting because the Romans have conquered the Greeks, and they lord, they've got power over the known world at that time. But that's militarily. When it comes to thought and language, the Greeks have conquered the Romans, and everybody's speaking Greek, and everybody hails the wisdom of the Greeks. And so the Hellenistic world is this world that's blending together different cultures and thoughts, and that's the world in which Christianity arises. Understanding Plotinus is essential for understanding Augustine, and then ultimately also for understanding Aquinas. So think of this as a foundation stone. You need Plotinus in order to then understand those Christian philosophers. He marries philosophy and religion, and so that's something that I do think that Dr. Nash says it, but maybe he doesn't say it as much as we need it to be said in order to understand it. He is not just philosophical, he is religious, very much so, about his system and the way he goes about the study of understanding what is and understanding reality. In his system, God, or the One, we don't want to say God in the sense that that's the same as Yahweh, the God of the Bible. In his system, the One is the source of all things, and humanity's given a way of sorts to return to and know God, but it's not something like the access that we have through Christ. He came from Egypt and he studied in Alexandria, and that's the ancient home of Philo, and it's a place that was awash with differing forms of Middle Platonism when he was there. At the age of 39, he founded a school of philosophy in Rome, and he did not begin to write down his teachings until 11 years later. After his death, his student Porphyry gathered up and organized his writings into the Enneads, which is from the Greek word for nine. And his school of thought is referred to as Neoplatonism. When you see the prefix neo, whether it's Neo-Darwinism or Neo-Orthodoxy, it just means new. It's a prefix meaning new. So this is the new Platonism. Because he was a man in process, I mean, he's a man across his life, like all of us are, who's thinking his way through things and who's maturing, hopefully, or trying to. Because he's a man in process, thinking through his philosophy over the course of his lifetime, and because his student Porphyry organized his work posthumously, not by when it was written, but by subject, his writings can seem contradictory or a bit muddled. Obviously, his thought was not static across a lifetime. No one's is. Porphyry mixed his writings from different time periods together without regard for their sequence. At least that's what it feels like on the receiving end of them. This has understandably created some confusion as to what his final views were. We have different views across time, so he may sound like he's contradicting himself because his thinking has changed. His interpreters try to untangle the confusion of the mixing of his writings, but it is, as Dr. Nash says, quite a challenge. Plotinus pictures reality as a series of layers, each derived from the layer above it. One way to picture Plotinus's universe is to think of a multi-tiered fountain. Water flows out at the top of the fountain and it fills the highest basin to overflowing. As water overflows the top of the highest basin, it drops into a second basin. When the second level fills up, the water overflows to still a third level, and so on. So here's a visual of that. The source of all that flows is the one. Look at the top, at the water squirting out. That's up at the top. Think that's where the one is. He's not intentionally in the business of creating, like Yahweh, the God of the Scriptures, but it all just naturally emanates from him. It's the overflow of his essence. And so as you see these different tiers overflowing, coming down, it's all just emanating, coming forth from the one. Plotinus explains the universe in terms of a downward movement or runoff from the one. Everything that exists is tied in some way to the one. And that sounds like pantheism of some sort. But Plotinus takes pains to make sure that it's not conceived of as pantheism. He doesn't want to create a pantheistic system. That's not the point. There's also an upward climb as the soul tries to free itself from the domination of the body and find its way back to its natural domain, which is the realm of the one from which everything emanated and came forth, and of eternal truth. Like Plato, Plotinus associates the body and the matter with that which is less good. So, even with evil, ultimately, but we'll get to that. Excuse me. Nash approaches Plotinus twice. First, he does a generalized overview, and then he gets more specific. So this slide presentation kind of flows with that. So if it sounds at times like it's redundant or repeating something, it's because I'm following how Dr. Nash laid this out. The one, or the good, is Plotinus' supreme, transcendent, and unknowable God. He's so transcendent that human language is unable to communicate any literal truth about it. All must be figurative. Now, just hit the pause button for a second there and say, this is problematic, and this is something that has been a tendency in not only philosophers, but also in theologians to say this kind of thing. Actually, in the Confessions of Augustine, Augustine says something that sounds like God is completely other. Karl Barth, the famous Swiss theologian, calls God totaliter aliter, wholly other. The problem is if God is wholly other, whether it's the God of the Scriptures or if it's the one of Plotinus, if he's wholly other, then we have no means with which to make contact with God, and there's not really anything meaningful we can take away from the study of God. Augustine winds up correcting what he said, and I don't. There's some problems with the way that Barth ultimately speaks, as far as what he has to say about the otherness of God. That just in terms of logic, I'm not calling Barth or Augustine when they say these things heretical. That's not the point. But it's that language matters, and if we say of God that he's wholly other, we're putting God in a category where we can't have really much in the way of relationship or even benefit from him as far as our knowledge of him. And so that's a problem for Plotinus, like it's a problem for some Christian philosophers and theologians. Plotinus says of the one, that no beings would exist if the one remained shut up in itself. All reality is a progressive emanation or movement away from the one. Excuse me. Things emanate. They flow from the one, the way light emanates from the sun, the way water flows from a spring that has no source outside of itself. The sun is never exhausted, it does not do anything, it just is, and being what it is, it necessarily emanates light. In this way, God, or the one, is the source of everything, and everything manifests God. But nothing is equal to God any more than the rays of light equal in any way the sun. Going on with emanation, here's some of the analogies: a fountain overflowing, light radiating out from a primary source. The Eternal One has always been producing the eternal level of nous, or mind. The eternal nous has always been giving rise to the eternal level of soul, as well as the other lesser levels of being. Plotinus believed that if something is perfect, it necessarily gives rise to other things. And so the worlds of intellect, soul, and body emanate from God, or the One, without diminishing God in any way. But the One does not do this willingly or intentionally. It's necessary and unavoidable that if something is full, then it must overflow. The process of emanation means that what would have remained mere potentiality within the One is actualized in the world. And we go on, if we study the One in Plotinus, and find that there is no potentiality with the One, because everything is actualized. There's nothing that's latent in the One. All of it is just realized all the time. This, of course, makes Plotinus' doctrine of creation not only impersonal, but unintentional. Our world, our minds, souls, and bodies are all just residual after effects of the existence of the One. We were brought into being by the existence of the One, but without intentionality, without design, and without any clear purpose or significance. This is very different from let us make man in our own image. In the image of God, He created them, He created him, male and female, He created them. It's not like that. We have no reason to believe that the One cares about us or has any future plans for us. And so here it's this emanation, those downward arrows, or this overflowing. And these are the things from the One that we participate in. We participate in nous, or mind. We participate in soul, which is an emanation from nous. And we participate in bodies, and because we have bodies, with primary matter. So this is Nash's figure. The downward path from the One to mind, or nous, to soul, to body. But then on the right-hand side, the upward path, that if one wants to make contact with the One, there's a way to do it. This is the way that in a different book by Dr. Nash, The Light of the Mind, which is a book that he has about the epistemology of St. Augustine, this is his depiction of it, the downward path of being. God, or the One, this is not Augustine, this is Plotinus, and then the nous, the mind or intelligence, and then the soul, and then bodies. And so human beings participating in these three aspects of the emanations that come from the One. Now, when we speak of the upward path of salvation, which was the right-hand side of Dr. Nash's diagram, here's what he says. According to the upward path of salvation, the human attainment of knowledge, virtue, and salvation requires that we find the way to gain deliverance from the domination of the body and achieve unity with the One. As long as humans are concerned with their bodies and sensation, their souls will remain enchained and entombed like the prisoners in Plato's cave. And it needs to be said, Plotinus is regularly drawing upon and speaking from the pre-Socratics, from Plato, and from Aristotle. He's oftentimes with Aristotle doing a compare and contrast and kind of standing with Plato. But he seems to have very broad knowledge of the philosophers who've come before him. So the upward path requires a disentanglement and a withdrawal from the concerns of the body and bodily sensation. I want you to hang on to that thought as we consider the One. Nash comes back and he goes more in depth with this. Plotinus, so this is him the second time around. Plotinus' God is pure, undifferentiated unity. He contains no parts. He is above being. He's wholly separate from and above everything else that exists. Inasmuch as the One is above being, it has no qualities or properties, no attributes. This part would actually harmonize with some things that are said about Allah in the Muslim faith. Allah, it's said, He's too transcendent for us to speak about His attributes, so we have the 99 names of Allah. So there's these names by which Allah can be spoken of that tell us things about Allah, but it's considered to be too much of an attempt to bring Allah down to our understanding to speak of attributes for Him. And that's very much what's going on here with Plotinus. With Plotinus, the One has no attributes. Now, he still would do something similar to what Islam does and speak of the one in terms of that which is good and faultless and so on. So this effectively, though, when he says these things, it renders the one unknowable. It puts him in a classification where we really can't access him with our mind, with our intellect, with our understanding. To say that God is one entails that God is transcendent and simple, meaning without parts, and contains no potentialities or the limitations of a body. God transcends all distinctions. God cannot even think in a way that implies a distinction between thoughts. So he's all the time possesses immediate self-awareness. Many well-known thinkers have attempted, this is Dr. Nash, have attempted to make God unknowable. However, this is a rather risky thing to try, since every one of these thinkers proceeded to produce a string of information about this supposedly unknowable deity. Plotinus himself knows quite a few things about his unknowable God. And that sounds ironical because it is ironic. First, Plotinus knows his unknowable God existed. That's an important piece of information. Second, he knew his unknowable God was unknowable. This statement has all the appearance of a logically self-defeating claim. Third, Plotinus knew there was one God, not 2 or 20 or thousands, as in the case of some religions that he knew about. The next thing Plotinus seems to know about his unknowable God is that he's immaterial and mental. Plotinus also knew that the one is not a mind, though it gives rise to mind. It gives rise to the nous. So it's at this level, the nous, of existence that Plato's forms reside. And it should be said that Plotinus believes that by mystical experience we can make contact with the forms, with the world of the forms, in this life. That's different from Plato. But I get ahead of myself. It's at this level of existence that Plato's forms reside, at the nous. Archetypes, or perfect forms of the imperfect things and beings found in our world, are comprised of the eternal thoughts of the One. Although the One is a perfect unity and is undifferentiated at the level of nous or mind, multiplicity or differentiation does occur, but it's after it has come forth from him. Here Plotinus becomes a bit hard to follow. Still going on nous, we can now add a new wrinkle to Plotinus's doctrine of intelligence. Plotinus came to distinguish at least two levels of mind, the higher and the lower. We can simplify things if we view the upper level of mind as the mind of God that contains Plato's forms. Even though we may think of this upper level of nous as the mind or thoughts of God, it is distinct from the One. Okay, you need to chew on that. Maybe I should just reiterate again. We can simplify things if we view the upper level of mind as the mind of God that contains Plato's forms. Even though we may think of this upper level of nous or mind as the mind or thoughts of God, it's actually distinct from the One. So that's just a distinction to hold in your mind, because it's hard, it's getting complicated. So here's him portraying that by means of a diagram. Higher mind is above, and that's the place where the forms reside, is in the mind of in the nous. The lower mind is that which is below, still speaking about mind, and then particular minds. And as I said, he does think we can make contact with what is essentially the world of the forms, and that is by way of mystical experience. Okay. Each particular intelligence in the world is an extension of the cosmic mind, nous. There's an ontological, that means as to the isness of the thing, there's an ontological connection between the minds of particular creatures and the mind of God. So that sounds somewhat similar to some of the things we read in Scripture, I mean, it's not the same thing, but like man being made in God's image, or it being in your light we see light, like it says in Psalm 36. But it needs to be said that the other is so other, or the one is so other, that we're not really warranted to draw those kinds of parallels. Nevertheless, there's an as to isness connection between the minds of God, of the one's creatures that overflow out of him, and the mind of God. Every particular intelligence is an extension of the nous. This gave Plotinus an answer to Plato's question about how human minds know the eternal forms. Humans know the forms because their own minds are a downward extension of the cosmic nous that is the natural home of the forms. Okay, that if you haven't heard the lecture on Plato, then this isn't going to make any sense as I'm saying all this. So here we have the one, and from the one comes the nous, the mind. And he suggests picturing this sort of like as a tornado that comes down. That's one way that you could try to visually picture it. So I used a water spout inverted. And it's coming down, and this is Mary. And so Mary, while she's alive, has mind. But when Mary dies, her nous is drawn back up into the cosmic nous from which it came. Let's read the two indented quotes on page 130 of Nash about this. They're quotes from Plotinus. So, if you have your book, the intelligence dwells entire within that region of thought we call the intelligible realm. Yet it comprises within itself a variety of intellective powers and particular intelligences. The intelligence is not merely one, it is one and many. In the same way, is there both soul and many souls. From the one soul proceeds a multiplicity of different souls, some of which are more rational, and others, at least in their actual existence, less rational in form. Again, in the intelligible realm, there is the intelligence, the nous, which, like some huge organism, contains potentially all other intelligences, and there are the individual intelligences, each of them in actuality. Think of a city as having a soul. The soul of the city would be more perfect and more powerful. What would prevent the souls of the inhabitants from being of the same nature as the soul of the city? Or again, take fire, the universal, from which proceed large and small particular fires. All of them have a common essence, that of universal fire. This is from the Ennead, the fourth Ennead. So, if this sounds vaguely familiar and a bit like something else you've heard, it has some affinities or similarities with the thought and the teachings of the Buddha. To achieve, the Buddha is just a title, the enlightened one for Siddhartha Gautama. To achieve nirvana is to become one with the cosmos. Nirvana can rightly be termed annihilation, meaning annihilation of the self or its blowing out like a candle and its absorption into the greater cosmos. So I'd go back to Mary and just show you. When Mary dies, then the nous is drawn back up into the one, and that's it. And that's very much like what goes on in the Buddhist schema. Each particular living thing is an extension of the cosmic soul, just as Aristotle distinguished between vegetative, animal, and rational souls. So Plotinus believes that living plants possess a vegetative soul, living animals possess both a vegetative and a sensitive soul, and humans possess a vegetative and sensitive souls plus a rational soul. We just dealt with this when we were dealing with Aristotle. All three levels of soul are extensions of the cosmic soul. As one moves down the various levels of soul, there is increasing multiplicity. The world contains more bodies than souls, more souls than minds, and so on. The further away we get from the one, the more of the different emanations there are. Plotinus thinks there are three levels of soul. The top level of soul, if you're familiar with Hinduism, the world soul is very similar to Atman, or if you have a psych background, if you think of the psychiatrist Carl Jung and his idea of the collective unconscious, the world soul is like that, emanating from the one. The middle soul is us, is the realm where human beings come forth from, middle soul, and so particular souls come from this. And then the lower soul is terminology used to describe everything physical in the bodies that then come. So everything is, the further away it gets from the one, the less perfect it is, and the more physical it becomes. The upper level is a cosmic or world soul, which helps explain motion and change in the world. The middle level is Plotinus' source for every particular instance of life in the universe. Going back and looking at that again. Each concrete instance of life or soul is an extension or emanation from the cosmic or world soul, the top part there. When the living being dies, its soul is reabsorbed into the world soul. So everything down below, middle soul, lower soul bodies, is then drawn back up into the world soul. In ways that are anything but clear, the lowest level of soul gives rise to body in general and to specific bodies in particular. Only the lowest level of soul is the source of matter that enters into direct contact with bodies. Bodies are less than soul, just like with Plato. Human souls exist on the middle level of soul, along with all the other particular souls existing in the universe. Plotinus rejects the materialistic theories of the soul that the Stoics had put forward, and the Epicureans as well, even though he also rejects the kind of reincarnation Plato represented or presented in his Phaedo. This means that we pre-existed in the world of the forms and then were born into this world. Even though he rejects that kind of reincarnation, he does teach that human souls are immortal and exist prior to their embodiment in this world. For Plotinus, the soul is a substance that exists in its own right. That is, it can exist independently of the body. That's different from Aristotle. Sensation depends upon the immortal and immaterial soul working in harmony with the body. Now, Nash says, let me pause to draw your attention to the rapidly developing complexity of Plotinus' universe. Just a few minutes ago, or so it seemed, we were focusing on the pure, undifferentiated unity of the One. Before we could blink, a cosmic mind, millions of particular minds, a world soul, billions of particular souls, and added billions of bodies are bumping into each other, like so many atoms in a crowded subway train. All of them owing their being to a sublimely perfect being who gave rise to all of this without wanting to, without willing to, and without doing anything. Which is, it feels a little impersonal, right? It feels like we're all just an accident or we're just a side effect. Okay, and so this is a diagram for that. Here's the one, and then nous, think of upper mind and lower mind as being nous, and then world soul, middle soul, lower soul. You could have it, and then ultimately there's you. So now the upward path of salvation. How do we have some sort of a spiritual, a transcendent experience, and ultimately perhaps become better men and women? The ultimate goal for humans should be union with the One, even though the One didn't intentionally give rise to us. But in order to attain this union, the soul must rise upward. It must free itself from its bondage to the body, pleasure, and sensation. As the soul leaves behind the realm of sensation, it comes closer to its ultimate goal, the One. So Plotinus' debt to Plato is kind of obvious, leaving the cave and going up to the world of light. As long as humans are concerned with their bodies and sensation, their soul is enchained and entombed like the prisoners in Plato's cave. So they have to, the reason for the smile. I'm sorry to be drawing parallels between Buddhism and Plotinus's thought, but it's like this. The smile, the kind of a Mona Lisa smile that you see on statues of the Buddha, is because the Buddha has done away with all tanha, or desire, within, and he has achieved a state of sukha, and so he no longer cares about the things of earth. He's withdrawn, he's transcended, and this is something like that. This is that we would transcend, we would withdraw from the physical. Humans, he says, who truly yearn for union with the One, can do only so much to bring themselves to the brink. Rarely, at unexpected times, this or that human being may suddenly experience a mystical vision of the One. In the words of Plotinus, because what the soul seeks is the One, and it would look upon the source of all reality, namely the good and the One, it must not withdraw from the primal realm and sink down into the lowest realm. Don't go down. Don't become more physical. Rather, it must withdraw from sense objects of the lowest existence and turn to those of the highest. It must free itself from all evil, since it aspires to rise to the good. I'm going to, I guess we can look at that. Page 134, second full paragraph, is the upper level is a cosmic or world soul, which helps explain motion and change in the world. This is world soul, middle soul, lower soul. Let's see, I've gone beyond that diagram. Okay. The middle level is Plotinus' source for every particular instance of life in the universe. Each concrete instance of life or soul is an extension or emanation from the cosmic or world soul. When the living being dies, its soul is reabsorbed into the world soul. I have that out of place. I'm going to skip Clark. So, apophatic theology is a term that we use to describe the via negatione or the via negativa. And it's used not just in Christian theology. It's a way of trying to say something positive by asserting all the negatives. By telling you what something is not, we're cutting away that which it's not and getting at what it is. when Michelangelo was asked about his carving of David, how had he done it? He said he just cut away everything that wasn't David. And so the via negativa is trying to do something like that. It's trying to cut away everything about this which isn't the one in the business of language and statements. So using the via negativa, Plotinus asserts that as the one begets all things, it cannot be any of them, neither thing, nor quality, nor quantity, nor intelligence, nor soul. The problem is if the one is this other, or this transcendent, how does Plotinus know these things to be so? Such knowledge seems humanly impossible to possess. How can a person know what God is not without first knowing what God is? And so, rightly, Gordon Clark quotes Paul Henry, saying that Henry concludes that negative theology must always be complemented by positive theology. If you say all these negatives, you've got to have some sort of a positive to say in order to counterbalance it, is the idea. So, when we're doing this apophatic sort of thing, or this via negativa, to arrive at what is, these are the ways we do this with God. We say that God is immortal, God's invisible, God's immutable, God's immaterial, God's incomprehensible, God's incorruptible, God's irresistible. But the problem is if we go too far down this path without saying something positive about what God is, what we wind up with is a God who's inconceivable. And the God of the Scriptures is not inconceivable. But whether we're doing it with Christianity or Judaism, or we're doing it with Plotinus' system, you do too much of this negative without affirming a positive, and you wind up with a God who's inconceivable. You can't really have any kind of a grasp on what this God is. If you've been told all that he's not, but not what he is, you're left with kind of a hole. You're left with a blank and empty nothing. Making God unknowable has two problems associated with it. How does the person making such claims know them to be so? Which Nash has pointed out. How does he know all this? Why should humans care about a totally other and separate God? This renders God humanly irrelevant. So that's really problematic. And that's the problem also when we have Christian theologians who want to make God wholly other, is that it renders him irrelevant there as well. So hold on. As Nash does point these kinds of things out, the inconsistencies. This is the third greatest of the ancient philosophers, and he had a great influence on Christian philosophy, especially on Augustine. He wasn't a simpleton. He had to know that there were problems with his understandings of the one, and his claims to know the things he asserts about the one. So why doesn't he hesitate to assert the things that he does? Well, it's because he's a mystic, and Christianity has had its mystics as well. Mystics are looking for not just theology, not just knowledge about God, but an experience, something subjective. And he has had, and claims to have had, wonderful subjective experiences of the one. He's a mystic. He thinks he has access to this information through his mystical experiences. What cannot be accessed by study and mere contemplation can be attained by an upward movement towards what he calls the unio or the unio mystica, the mystical union of the finite self with the one. Now, Christianity does not have this. It doesn't have a union with God. It has communion with God, and that's a little bit of a difference. Speaking of what happens when the soul rises to the level of mind, Plotinus writes, "So ascending, the soul will come first to the intelligence, and will survey all the beautiful ideas therein, and will avow their beauty. For it is by these ideas that there comes all beauty else, by the offspring and the essence of the intelligence. What is beyond the intelligence we affirm to be the nature of good, radiating beauty before it." Think of the world of the forms. But now this is in the mind of the one, and then shared with its creatures by way of emanation. There, one, in the solitude of self, one meaning human beings, one in the solitude of self beholds simplicity and purity, the existence upon which all depends, towards which all look, by which reality is. Life is, thought is. For the good is the cause of life, of thought, of being. So his solution to the moral problem of humanity is contemplation of the higher soul and a retreat from one's fleshly nature into one's higher nature. The mind rises above the material world. And this is why I was saying there's some similarity to this in the thought of Siddhartha Gautama. So I have to kind of draw this backwards, or back, moving from the bottom up. Sensation or sense perception, the world in which we live. and then purposely withdrawing for purposes of contemplation and moving into the mystical, pursuing contact with that which is above our level of existence. And in Plotinus, there's ultimately communio. Well, communio is something that Christianity has as well. The idea of communion, that we have, we're with God. You know, Jesus saying to us, "Lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the age." And the many, I think of Isaiah 43, that I'll be with you when you pass through the waters, and so on. There's no question that the Christian believes that they are with God, that God is with them. But then the unio concept that is here in Plotinus, becoming one with the world soul, that's something different. That they're becoming one with God, being absorbed into God. He's an advocate of a unique form of philosophical / religious mysticism. It's not an organized religion, but there's something religious about his philosophical mysticism. So this is from the life of Plotinus. Plotinus was so concerned with the welfare and ultimate salvation of each individual soul that he elevated philosophy, the highest pursuit of the soul, to the level of a divine act, capable of purifying each and every soul of the tainting accruals of sensual existence. His last words, recorded by Porphyry, his student, more than adequately summarize the goal of his philosophy. Strive to bring back the God in yourselves to the God in the all. So there's something divine about human beings by way of emanation, and if we would have mystical experiences, we might connect with the one. In its final ultimate form, salvation is not a matter of what one knows. It occurs instead in the form of a mystical trance. The mind of the human thinker is absorbed briefly, unconsciously, ineffably into the one. During this mystical trance, persons lose all awareness of the body. Indeed, there disappears any awareness that the thinker is human or real. But then there's some problems with this, and this is what Dr. Nash points out. This is hardly surprising during a state in which all distinctions appear. After the trance is over, the person cannot report any information about the experience. But should we not be wary when we're invited to make a blind leap into the arms or lap of an unknowable deity? How do we know the entity that catches us will turn out to be the good rather than some evil and sinister being? So that's a fair question, and it's we're opening ourselves up to something that we would want to be very careful about. Listen to Plotinus himself as to how this works. He says, all men from birth onward live more by sensation than by thought, forced as they are by necessity to give heed to sense impressions. Some stay in the sensate. That means the place where you're just focused on the sensual, on what you can experience with your five senses, their whole life long. For them, sense is the beginning and the end of everything. Good and evil are the pleasures of sense and the pains of sense. It is enough to chase the one and flee the other. They're just, all they are is people driven by feeling. Those of them who philosophize say that therein wisdom lies. Others do lift themselves a little above the earth. Excuse me. Their highest part transports them out of the pleasurable into the honorable. But, unable to perceive anything higher, and with nowhere to set themselves, they don't achieve what they were after ultimately. They don't have the experience, kind of disappointed. They fall back in virtue's name on the activities and options of that lower realm they had thought to escape. So now there comes something that's a little bit of a, what I say, elitist. So there's those who try, but they fall short. But there is another, a third class of men godlike in the greatness of their strength and the acuity of their perceptions. He of course classes himself there. They see clearly the splendors that shine out from on high. Thither, out of the mist and fogs of the earth, they lift themselves. There they stay, seeing from above what is here below, taking their pleasure in truth. Again, it's interesting to see the parallels between this and Siddhartha Gautama. So, going on from here, one of the things that's pointed out by Nash, and it's something useful and it's something that will be brought up in Augustine, is that he sees evil as a privation of goodness, meaning that evil doesn't have any isness to it. It doesn't have substance. Now that accords with Christianity in some ways. What do I mean by that? Well, that evil is parasitic in its nature. It makes nothing. It creates nothing. All it does really is twist and pervert that which is good. And so if you think of Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, Tolkien is a Christian. He's a Catholic, Roman Catholic Christian. And in his world, the orcs are elves who were captured and were twisted and deformed. There's a place in which this is commented on in his works. And the trolls are ents who had the same kind of a thing that they experienced. And so Morgoth, or Melkor, who becomes Morgoth, and then his servant Sauron, they can't make anything. All they can do is take that which is good and twist it. And ultimately, there's a parasitic nature to evil. The enemy of your soul, biblically speaking, the evil one, can't really make anything new. What he can take is those things which are God's, and he can distort them, and he can try to put things that are good things at center stage and make them ultimate things. This is going to be helpful for Augustine coming out of his background in Manichaeanism, as we'll see in the next chapter as we deal with the next lecture. So evil is spoken of as a privation of goodness. It's the absence of goodness, much as dark is the absence of light. Nash uses Philip Merlin to speak of how Plotinus comes dangerously close to equating matter with evil, after the fashion of the Gnostics, whom he wishes to reject and differentiate himself from. And that's valid. It's a valid thing. He's walking like a tightrope walk as far as almost making it be that matter itself is evil, but he doesn't go that far. And so that's it's proto-Gnosticism, or forms of Gnosticism, that the early church is dealing with and battling. And so the first of all the heresies that the church is dealing with is the denial of the bodily resurrection of Christ, and even the physical incarnation of Christ. Thus, in John's first epistle, if any spirit confesseth not Christ is come in the flesh, this is Antichrist. And so he's close to that kind of thought, but he doesn't go all the way there. But you can feel, we're getting kind of almost in that direction where we would call the physical evil. Clearly wishing to avoid any appearance of dualism, Plotinus rejects the belief that matter exists on its own and argues instead that matter is the most distant point from the one, the point at which all emanations from the one disappear into the darkness of non-being. The evil found in matter is not a positive force like the evil darkness of Manichaeanism. It's an absence of being that passes its deficiencies onto the bodies that could not exist without it. In this way, primary matter becomes the reason for all of the imperfections of the physical world, which is very much like Plato. It also accounts for the moral failings of particular human souls. Problem of the one and the many, I think this is the last of our slides. Problem of the, no, we're going to deal with something with the Trinity. Problem of the one and the many and the problem of multiplicity is dealt with on page 137, and both Clarke and Armstrong are cited. Ultimately, Nash shows that the arising of multiplicity out of unity is unexplained. How is it that out of the oneness all this, the many different beings come forward? It's a neat solution to the problem of the one and the many, remember form and matter, but a solution without a basis. Over against that, he says that Clarke and others have shown the superiority of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity as an explanation for this issue. God is both single and plural in different ways in the Christian system of belief. So this is an ancient diagram, this is a stained glass window, of what we're saying when we speak of the Trinity. It is not a diagram of the Trinity, don't misunderstand. Look at the P at the top of this triangular shape that's in the middle of the circle. That's Patrius. And then if you look down to your left, SS, that's Spiritus Sanctus. You look to your right, you see that F, that's Filius. So Father, Holy Spirit, Son. In the middle you see Deus, God. And then you see the branches going from the P and the SS and the F. Each says Est, Est, Est. That's the Father is God, and the Holy Spirit is God, and the Son is God. But now on the outer perimeter of the circle, the Spirit's not the Father's not the Son, the Son is not the Spirit. And so this is a diagram of what we're saying when we speak of the Trinity. And so we have the Trisagion in the Scripture. And we have it said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And this depiction of God as being one and yet three would be a contradiction if we were saying God was one in the very same way that he's three. We're saying that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are one in their deity, but that they are separate in person. And so this is definitely superior to the picture that we see in Plotinus. And more on that to come. That ends our lecture.